So Udan, over to you. Thank you very much. And let's all give Udan a warm welcome.
Thank you, Anna. And let me first say how happy I am to speak. Although it's a Zoom meeting, I could have also spoken from elsewhere, but I'm speaking from the Center for South Asian Studies at University of Hawaii at Manoa. And it's always nice that I could do it, physically as well. So I've met Anna and a couple of other staff of the center beforehand. So let me first place on record my thanks to Anna and also Ashok Das and also Professor Vimal Disanayaka, who have been setting the stage for me to speak. And a word on the Sri Lankan awareness of University of Hawaii. Not very many people come to University of Hawaii for their studies, but those who have made it to Hawaii have really made a name for their scholarship. So people who have done their doctoral studies here are very well known, respected, and recognized in the academic sphere in Sri Lanka and elsewhere. So it's I consider it a privilege for me to be here and speak from the university itself. Okay, so let me tell a little bit about the topic. Hope you can see the slideshow as I speak. Yeah, good. And although I come from South Asia and my basic kind of my main focus had been South Asia, and you would know why my interest in speaking about Singapore. So I'm going to say why that is initially, and then a little bit about the Singaporean political system and more on the practice and the culture of politics there, and a bit on civil society space or civic space in Singapore, and a particular app, a technological device they came up with during the pandemic, and then bring some kind of political and legal changes that took place during the pandemic time, and the interplay between those changes and the civic behavioral trends. So that's basically the content of my speech this morning or noon, and then I have done a bit of photo documentation of a particular visual behavior, if I may use that term, of in different public spaces, and I'm trying to kind of I'm going to show you some pictures that I've documented, and trying to make a link between those and also my bigger kind of narrative. And I try to end with a couple of tentative conclusions. Yeah, so that's going to be the flow of my presentation. A quick word on my own vantage point, as I do this presentation. So as I said, I'm not Singaporean. I don't live there. I have a basis for me to live by because of my personal circumstances. But it has been kind of I don't consider myself an expert on Singapore. So my kind of vantage point, I must say, to be kind of is largely observational and relatively new, I would say. So the analysis could also be tentative, and I don't want to kind of come up with a very a well kind of formulated conclusion, but I would say some tentative conclusions. All right, so let me start the story. The case of Singapore. Why I talk about Singapore? My own interest on Southeast Asia, particularly Singapore, is because it's also it's also a space where a lot of South Asians are living, working, and interacting. So although it's Singapore, I also keep an eye on following the South Asian kind of dynamics in Singapore. As far as our topic is concerned, the pandemic, Singapore is important because Singapore's port, particularly the airport, is a major air traffic hub. So with the pandemic situation, with the spread of a virus, an airport is a dangerous place. And then there's another factor, which is a heavy traffic between Singapore and China for business, for trade, work, study, tourism, and so on. So a virus which was said to be originated in China, and then Singapore having a close traffic with China puts Singapore at risk. And then there's also a considerable number of Chinese migrant workers living in Singapore. The estimate is about 200,000. So with this background, I took Singapore as an interesting case, and partly because in the initial months, particularly January and February 2020, since Singapore had had their first case in January itself, Singapore was kind of was considered a good case, or they had a best practice in terms of responding to the pandemic. So the kind of the measures that they took, the procedures they introduced was quite comprehensive and efficient and timely. And the World Health Organization, gave what they call the gold standard for management of the pandemic. And other, there were case studies carried out in Harvard and so on. So basically, Singapore became, the first poster boy in the initial stages of the pandemic. And there's a reason for that, in terms of, a particular indicator they used. The first 50 days since the identification of the first case. And that's one way of kind of, of assessing the management of the spread of the virus. So you can see the graph, and the comparison is made, between a few countries: Iran, Italy, South Korea, Japan, US, and Singapore. So these countries, how did the cases develop in the first 50 days since the first case was detected or identified? So you see the steep kind of curves of other countries, particularly, the ones except Japan, and Singapore is having, I mean, that the curve is almost kind of horizontal, and with a very low number of cases since the first case was detected. So this was the basis for using or considering Singapore as a best practice in terms of management. But this was short-lived, and the decline started from March, when the country was compelled to impose what they call a circuit breaker, which is the equivalent to a lockdown from April 3rd, and it was extended up to June. But the biggest crisis happened when there was a huge spread of cases amongst the foreign workers. And these foreign workers are important because of this reason. The Singaporean population is 5.45 million, and out of that, 4 million are citizens and permanent residents, and the rest, which is 1.45 million, are foreign workers. I mean, the bulk, the bigger, let's say 1.5 million foreign workers belong to different categories. Some of them are considered expatriates who are doing top jobs, CEOs or CFOs or IT professionals and so on. But then you have other categories of workers semi-skilled, unskilled, and skilled, and so on. So the bulk of them, which is about 300,000, are migrant workers engaged in the construction industry. And like the large part of them, about 90% of them, come from South Asia. So from countries like India, Bangladesh, and Nepal. Not so much from Sri Lanka. Sri Lankans, there are a lot of helpers or housemaids who come from Sri Lanka, but not so much Sri Lankans in the construction industry. The construction industry is largely, from workers coming from India, Bangladesh, and Nepal. So it's a big 300,000 in Singapore is a large number because the population itself is about 5 million. So what happened was the spread happened in a out of control manner amongst the construction workers, and the reason was that of their living conditions and how they were kind of their accommodation, and they were basically living in very congested, cramped up dormitories, which so the control of the spread of the virus was almost impossible because they live in a the distancing wasn't possible, and they were also using the same showers, the bathrooms, and so on, and the toilets and so on. So they couldn't control, and the numbers went by 500,000 by the day. In Singaporean standard, it was almost a crisis. So other than the health kind of issue, which was kind of arrested subsequently quite efficiently, there was another kind of another dimension to it, which was the public awareness and the concern on the plight of the migrant workers. And not that they were aware of the conditions, but this became kind of known, discussed, and also debated. Concerns were raised on the substandards of their accommodation, the working conditions, their transportation system, and so on. So triggered by the pandemic, by the health challenge, there was also a kind of a public debate on how we treat how Singapore treats the migrant workers. So that this formed a major kind of a discussion point within the civic space. And to understand how things happened in Singapore, the civic space, I think we should also have a little understanding about how politics are practiced in Singapore. So Singapore has a Westminster Model, the British model of governance with 3 separate branches: the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. So you have a president, which is largely kind of ceremonial, but president is the head of state, and you have the prime minister and a cabinet, which forms the government. And the Singaporean system is that it's a multi-party system. So you have regular elections, and the parties can field their candidates. But in practice, what has happened, since Singapore became a kind of a separate entity or a country, the leading political party, which is the People's Action Party, founded and promoted by the legendary Lee Kuan Yew. In the initial elections, this party won all of the seats in the parliament. So 100% parliamentarians, MPs, are representing the People's Action Party. This happened in 68, 72, 1976. And so in effect, there was no opposition. So it's only the only the government, which is the government is 100% from one party. And but there was legal provision for a an opposition, but in practice it never happened in the first three elections. And it's only in 1981 there was one opposition, kind of MP who came from a constituency. So he was a lone kind of a loner in the parliament. I think at that time they had about 69 or 70 seats. So there's one member from the opposition, but the rest is primarily from one party. And this changed slightly in the subsequent elections. In 1984, there were two opposition members. Then it fell down to one again, and 91, 4, 97, 2, and by 2005, 6. But it's the overwhelming majority is represented by the People's Action Party, which governed the country. And one feature was that although there were a couple of opposition MPs, the institution of or institution which is called the leader of the opposition, or the opposition itself, was not kind of recognized in legal terms de jure. It was accepted as de facto, but there was no legal recognition of the existence of the opposition. So there was no office or a kind of a secretariat for the leader of the opposition during this time. But there were some opposition voices. Then the civic space. So that's the kind of the overall political culture, the practice. So predominantly a kind of a single voice, or overwhelmingly unitary voice, which is represented by the ruling party, which is PAP. And this had a kind of had an impact on the civic space as well. So dissent, opposing ideas were not that prevalent in the civic space. So in other words, Singapore has a low tolerance for dissent and diverse ideas. And there are a lot of legislature which would kind of curb or control the kind of public mobilization for protests, or for everything is controlled. I mean, you can do it, but there are you need to take your permit, and then you need to prove that it's for a particular purpose, and there are certain clauses. So practically the space is quite limited. And then particularly from 2019, there was a piece of legislature called Protection from Online Falsehoods and Manipulation Act, POFMA in short, which control the kind of cyberspace or the online space as well, because by this time the online platforms were quite strong. The civic space was not essentially taking place in a kind of a physical manner, but it was also taking place at a digital or cyber kind of space. And even that space was to some extent monitored and regulated by way of this act. So and there are also other kind of restrictions that put kind of limitations on individual liberties. You can speak, but there are regulations on freedom of speech in the name of maintaining racial harmony. So indirectly, your freedom of expression is controlled to some extent. The government could argue that it's for common good, but the kind of the diversity of ideas, expressed by people is kind of somewhat limited. And then I have quoted some, some literature from Singapore itself, which suggests that Singapore also lacks a confrontational media and also a vibrant civil society. And even the limited space which is occupied by civil society remains a peripheral force, only pursuing causes which are allowed by the state. So everything is kind of, everything is happening under the watchful eye of the government, and there are various agencies that keep a close eye on what's happening. So the civic space is not that vibrant and large. So observations happen in this kind of a situation. So what happened in the initial stages of pandemic, going back to the pandemic story, is that Singapore came up with an app which you can see on the screen. It's on the mobile, and there was also another small device which you can use if you're not using a mobile phone. Which basically was promoted by the government, and later on it became essential, for people to have that app if you are to kind of enter the public spaces, the shops, the offices, and so on. So it's only the private spaces, your own kind of domestic spaces which were allowed to be kind of accessed without the app. So what this does is that whenever you check into an office or a market or or any such public space, you need to check in. You need to kind of scan your give your details by way of the QR code. And then when you're allowed to enter the space, and then when you check out, you need to kind of use the app to say that you have checked out from there. So this was one of the first devices or first kind of apps used in the world for this purpose. So what it does is that it could trace all the movements of a person. And then if there's detection of one case in a particular, let's say a market, then that time, so if I have checked in at a particular time when another person who was detected with the virus, at the same time, then the whole cluster of people who came with me at a particular time, let's say 15 minutes, can be traced, and they will be sent, the notice of for quarantine. So this was very efficient way of tracing the spread of the virus, but it also came up with a lot of critique from the perspective of privacy and basically a violation of privacy, and also there was allegations of the information of movement by people being used for other purposes, for intelligence or for police information and so on. So this was debated a lot, but this became all mandatory, and the practical kind of usage of the app was as high as 92% by May 2021, and by now it has gone even up, because without the app you cannot practically do anything. You cannot go to a grocery store or to a doctor or to your own office or to another office and so on. So everybody has this app, and each and everybody's movement is monitored. The kind of response or what happened in the Civic Dynamics when this was introduced together with other rules and regulations of pandemic measures, was eventful from Singapore standards. There was no major kind of anti-vax, movement or sentiment in Singapore. I think there were some who were kind of opposing, but in silence, they were not very vocal. So there was no organized or informal way of kind of protesting. So there was no anti-vax movement as such that you could observe in other countries. And even the lockdown, what was called circuit breakers, had exceptions. So you could do your groceries, you could go to your pharmacy to get your medication, and then you could also visit a park to do your physical exercise. So because of that, there was some element of kind of movement and freedom. So therefore the resistance or the kind of frustration there was no reason for that. But in other countries, the lockdowns were completely kind of were very strict. In Asia, they were not allowed to move out, so you could only be dependent on online kind of purchase, which will be kind of delivered to your doorstep. On the use of face masks, it was very the enforcement was very strict. In Singapore, the level of enforcement and also the kind of compliance in anything is quite high. The government is a very although it's a capitalistic kind of private a system, the government plays a very crucial role. So the public policy and the enforcement is quite high in Singapore. And because of the political culture, there's also a high level of compliance. So the dissent or the kind of the refusal or the resistance is generally low or absent in Singapore. But there was some incidents which attracted a lot of media attention. Certain sections of expats calling themselves sovereigns, and they were refusing to adhere to some of the measures like wearing face masks or maintaining social distancing and so on. So this created a bit of reactions on the part of the locals on their attitude on expat workers, and this is particularly the top-notch kind of expat workers, and there was some debate on that. Do we really need them? And this was also kind of triggered or kind of worsened compounded by the uncertainties in the initial stages on jobs. There were a lot of retrenchment. For instance, Singapore Airlines, which is one of the biggest companies, they retrenched a lot of workers, including their pilots. So people were feeling that pressure, and they always had a kind of and triggered by some of the behavior of the expats, basically resisting kind of or ridiculing the pandemic measures. There was some kind of discussion among the locals on the expat workers. This was also taken up by some smaller political parties, not the main party, but the smaller political parties. Then the biggest impact was, the debate on migrant workers. I raised this issue before. So that discussion was quite vibrant. And for the first time, the Singaporean civic or citizens were talking a lot about the force behind one of their biggest successes, or pillar of success of the economy, which is the construction industry. and the price, the cost they had to pay to make Singapore, prosperous. So it was one kind of profound debate that the civic space was occupied at that time. And this was happening in a time which was largely locked down. So that these discussions, these debates took place mainly in the cyberspace. And then the political and certain legal changes that took place during the pandemic was, in July, there was an election. And it's tricky, to have an election in the middle of a pandemic due to physical reasons, due to health reasons, it's a big challenge. But there's also a higher challenge. You run a larger risk of putting yourselves, the political parties for election at a time when people are in general, very kind of, they are uncertain, they are angry, they are frustrated, they're desperate on around the issues or around the challenges created by the pandemic. But the ruling party went ahead with their resolution of having an election. The ruling party, the government, introduced a lot of measures to support the businesses, the smaller businesses, as well as the bigger businesses, and also the sections of society that need help. So quite a generous, portion of the budget was set aside for, to support the businesses and also the people or the sections of society that need help. So, but still, there was a lot of frustration, a lot of anger, a lot of uncertainty on the part of the people. So the elections happened in a kind of a somewhat uncertain environment, but it was a very kind of people were very enthusiastic as far as the election was concerned. The voter turnout was very high, and it was like the highest voter turnout. It was 23-year high, and so this kind of indicated a strong political interest on the part of the people. They couldn't, they didn't allow the physical rallies, which are like the normal kind of way of campaigning, which mobilizers, promote the people. It wasn't allowed because of the pandemic reasons, and also the campaign period was short. It was just a 9-day, campaign period. Without physical outreach, so the online campaigning was allowed, and there were a lot of opportunities for people to engage at that level. So what happened was something special, and for the first time in the recent history of Singapore, opposition was able to win 10 seats. So in Singaporean standard, this was unheard of, and this was a significant kind of political change. It wasn't a defeat for the ruling party, which is PAP, but losing 10 seats was a big kind of wake up call for the ruling party. So what happened was, for the first time in history, the Singaporean Parliament recognized the institution of the leader of the opposition. So Mr. Pritam Singh was recognized as a leader of the opposition, and the facilities, the secretariat, and the office, and also the budget was set aside for the institution of the leader of the opposition, which is in legal terms, it was accepted or recognized de jure, not just de facto. So this was a major political change that took place in the middle of a pandemic. So now I go to another, so this is basically the large part of the story, and I would like to, share with you the pictorial or the visual, side of my data collection, and it is to do with a particular aspect of this of the TraceTogether app. Now, before I introduce that, a little, introduction to how Singapore is organized, and the emphasis they place on cleanliness and tidiness, keeping things clean and tidy. So Singapore is also called a fine city, not with the meaning of it's being fine or good, but fine in terms of like you need to pay a fine for little each and everything that you violate when you be in a public space. So smoking, water wasting, or it's you also have what's called urinating in lift. For every little thing, you're fined. And chewing gum, chewing gum is also banned in, and you're fined if you chew gum. And there's a little background to that, because initially in the 80s, Singapore found that they are spending a lot of money to remove the the gum, which is kind of which people have just thrown on sidewalks, lifts, keyholes, or in public spaces. And so it was very costly, and there's some reference to Lee Kuan Yew's statement saying that he took it as a kind of as a threat, or what he called a palpable attack on Singapore's ambition to be perfect. That's how Lee Kuan Yew, the prime minister at that time, viewed this problem. So some of us might think that chewing gum is a tiny thing, but he took it very seriously, to the extent that it was banned. To date, chewing gum is banned in Singapore. Among other lot of things like litter, graffiti, jaywalking, and all that. They're all kind of you have laws, and they are offenses, and you need to pay a hefty fine if you commit them. So that's basically the background of how public space, the physical aspect of public spaces are kind of maintained. These are the standards of the physical standards of a public space, and the behavior which is expected from the public. So what happened with the app is that when you enter a public space, you need to there's an attendant who's also there physically, but the administration is done electronically. So you have the QR code which you see. So you need to place your mobile phone or the little device to check in, and later on, when vaccination was also made mandatory, they would also check whether you're vaccinated, and if you're not vaccinated, you're not allowed entry. So what happens is that once you get the green signal, from the device, the attendant would give one of these stickers to the person who's entering the particular public space or the market or the office. So you need to wear it on, attire, the place where others can see that you have got the pass, to enter. So the stickers, are the, like the evidence to say that you have the permission to enter. So you enter and do whatever you want to do, buy your groceries, or you go to the bank, whatever. And then when you leave the space, you need to, in Singapore, everything is organized, neatly. And for them, it was a problem to see thousands, if not, hundred thousands of these stickers, what to do with them, if the people, they don't carry them home, or they would make the effort to throw it into a kind of a bin or so. So what they did was they introduced, they placed another board with the sign that please stick your sticker after, when you're leaving. So you have this picture of, one man leaving, and they would kind of place the sticker. So this became a kind of from a visual point of view, a new feature in public spaces. So this is what I did. I just photo documented these, boards with stickers. So this is an assigned kind of what you see is an assigned place to paste your sticker when you're leaving. So it's a board, and you can see, and from a artistic point of view, one could also see certain kind of pattern or art in itself, in this. And then sort of different forms, it took different forms, and they were also pasting this on kind of surfaces that they are not supposed to paste. So this is one. And then they were also pasting the stickers on the railing of the staircase, which was not the assigned place. So there was some kind of soft violating of the rule, compared with the high standards of keeping things in the right place and so on. So so this is what I did by just kind of collecting, photo documenting these different ways of what I call the sticker behavior. And maybe 30 years back, my argument is that these stickers could be pasted or returned or disposed in a different way. But there was some form of a different, I don't want to kind of come up with a quick conclusion, but some form of deviation from a strict form of compliance. As you can see here, so that's the pictorial part of my story. From the bigger story as well as from the sticker story, as a kind of a general conclusion, what I want to share with you, and this is a tentative one, is the following. Now the pandemic time was, this is not only this was not only the case of Singapore, but also many other countries and states. And there was some form of reassertion, of the role of the government or the role of the state. In some countries, the government or the state role was kind of, they had a role, but it wasn't a kind of a very visible role. People did their own things, and for them, listening to a message from the government or the state or a particular state agency wasn't crucial to run their daily lives. But the pandemic situation gave a new life or new lease of life to the state, because state took everything to their fold, and they were kind of arranging or kind of, they were imposing. So for every little thing, the top-down kind of dictate comes from the state, and the people's daily life, patterns were heavily controlled, and they were mandatory. For instance, wearing the masks. I think in modern history, or even one would say modern kind of civilization, the mask became a revolutionary kind of enforcement. The level of enforcement of mask was high. I don't think that that form of enforcement on the part of the world wasn't could be observed in the last even say 200 years. So what I want to say is that Singapore wasn't an exception to that. But Singapore, being a very kind of a state-centric country, they kind of, but still there was some form of deviation from not, the citizens could run their, work, they could do their jobs, they could send kids to schools, but here, the government kind of tried to reassert their role in the context of the pandemic. But at the same time, there was also a certain level of different, behavior on the part of the citizens, and this was kind of manifested in different ways. Their response to the migrant workers, and then the kind of the culmination of these kind of change of people's behavior was the election. One could kind of I cannot come up with a strong kind of a argument that there is a strict correlation between the public discourse and the outcome of the election. And but one can make a case or dig deeper into. So that's what I'm trying to do in the next phase of my research, to see whether there was some kind of a correlation between the civic, the dynamics or the changes that happened in the civic sphere, and the subsequent kind of behavior which was manifested in their electoral patterns or electoral choices. And so that's the kind of and also the sticker story that I came up with, whether that kind of indicates a certain level of not resistance, but some form of deviation from the strict compliance culture they had. So basically, whether the state civic relations are kind of reconfiguring to some extent, not in a radical way, but in Singaporean terms, in some form. So that's basically the kind of curiosity that I have, and also to kind of and continue the rest of my research. But so these are some of the preliminary findings and certain tentative conclusions which I want to share with this group as part of my speech. So that's I would like to in my presentation, but I would be very happy to interact with you and listen to your feedback, answer any questions that you want to raise, and so on. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Udan. This was really, really interesting. I think I would love to hear everybody else's questions. My policy has been to turn off the recording just so whoever doesn't necessarily want to be on YouTube doesn't have to. But I want to ask my question because I'm fine with being on YouTube, and then I'm going to stop the recording. So my question is, how is the, or has the perception in Singapore of migrant workers, especially those from South Asia, changed in this recent past in relation to everything that you've been talking about?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's an kind of they existed, people knew, so it wasn't a secret, but it was the way the logistics of or the spatial planning was such that the migrant workers were stationed, in a particular area of the city in dormitories. So during the first 6 days of the week, they are working and they are transported, from their dormitories to their respective construction sites. And so what people see is and that form of transportation is also kind of questioned. It was questioned during the pandemic time. They're not taken in buses or so, and they need to sit on the the chassis of the lorry, which is like how open and somehow like semi-covered. So it's not the ideal way of transportation. They need to just sit on the floorboard, of the lorry. And also they are on their free day, which is usually Sunday. Their movements are also kind of not legally but practically happens in a particular area which is called Little India, and a lot of my pictures are from Little India, and particularly from a market called Tekka Market in the area called Serangoon. So there was there were no hard feelings or kind of strong opinions in whatever form about the South Asian migrant workers. They are generally considered hardworking. I think that could be one reason why Sri Lankans are not recruited for construction workers. That's my kind of guess. They believe that the Nepali, Bangladeshi, and Indian workers are much more kind of hardworking and efficient than Sri Lankans, who could also handle heavy workloads. So from the job market, they are in demand. But how the society looks at them, it wasn't a major kind of factor until there was a major incident a few years back when there was some form of what they call riots, in Little India, in Serangoon area, when there was when one of the workers was run over by a bus. There was a commotion, and there was a lot of people, trying to so there was some activity which was called riots, and in Singaporean standard it was quite a kind of an event. So that was one kind of incident that I can recall, but that didn't kind of create a kind of a profound or a larger debate on the conditions of the migrant workers. But during the pandemic time, there was a vibrant debate on the South Asian construction work, particularly the construction workers, the deplorable conditions under which they have to work, pay and also the kind of the benefits for the Singaporean economy and so on. So it was one of the moments of truth, for the Singaporean civic space.
Thank you.